Nightcast. Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth brings you the current news from the world today and how it relates to Bible prophecy. Understanding the end-time events leading to the peaceful world tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth.
Good evening, friends, and welcome to this November 3rd, 2014 edition of Nightcast. The president of Guyana, where the first case of Ebola was recorded in West Africa, has welcomed the rush of international support for the three countries at the center of the outbreak. However, Alpha Conde also criticized other West African nations which he accused of isolating and demonizing Guyana. He was, in this interview, he's speaking with Ibrahima Diane.
In the beginning, the WHO and MSF didn't communicate well. They didn't say that Ebola is a serious disease, but you don't necessarily die from it. If you do not tell a patient that he can recover, why do you want him to go to the hospital? I frankly believe that the international community, I'm not talking about Africa, is supporting us. They are united with us because they've all realized that Ebola is not just an African issue. It is a global one, that it threatens peace and security. The first to close their borders with us are the ECOWAS countries. If your neighbor demonizes you, why don't you want those who are far to do the same?
The president of Uganda, Mr. Yoweri Museveni, advised his own aides and population not to shake hands. You are not doing that.
The fact that you shake people's hands doesn't mean that you will get Ebola. This is totally absurd. It creates unnecessary panic. However, you have to remember to regularly wash your hands after you shake people's hands, and it goes away.
Okay, friends, that's our first story that relates to the fourth seal, which on our chart we'll show you here. I'll bring it forward. We'll show you real quickly. Go over four columns. You see the fourth seal is depicted in Revelation 6 as a pale horse, a pale green color horse with a rider whose name is Death. And alongside, or at the heels of, following right on the heels of this horse and its deadly rider, is Hades, hell, the grave. So says Revelation 6. And Jesus Christ described the activities of this horse with three different terms that the gospel writers Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote up in Greek as loimos, seismos, and terike. Loimos being the primary thing of disease epidemics that relates to our opening story tonight. And he also mentioned seismos, seismic conditions, earthquakes, gale force winds, and terike, disturbances, trouble. And we'll have stories that relate to that later in tonight's news. But more on this subject of the Ebola crisis. Volunteer health care workers are needed. According to this next story, the United Nations is appealing for thousands of healthcare workers to volunteer to help in those countries worst affected by Ebola. Even experienced doctors and nurses require significant special training to work in Ebola-affected areas. Imogen Faucus reports from Geneva.
Learning how to care for Ebola patients in a quiet corner of Geneva. But these healthcare workers will soon be on their way to Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea. Willing volunteers for a job they all know carries risks.
It's a responsibility. I have a set of skills that I feel I can offer. I really feel as though this is a region that deserves our attention right now. I think medical care is something we can provide that can actually make a difference in lives where there oftentimes is not adequate medical care.
Caring for Ebola victims means these volunteers will have to abandon the usual, often quite personal relationship they have with their patients.
Most doctors and nurses won't have learned how to wear this sort of thing in their basic medical training. But for health workers in Ebola regions, it's essential to save patients' lives and protect their own.
The Ebola regime is painstaking. Mistakes could cost lives. Just taking off the protective clothing safely takes at least 15 minutes.
My work in emergency rooms, you're used to moving very fast-paced. And I think the hardest part here is going to be moving very slowly, very meticulously, and just paying really close attention to every action that you're making.
And as those who have already spent time in Ebola-affected countries know, the work will take a psychological toll as well.
You won't get a hug from your colleague, you don't shake hands, you don't share anything, you don't even share a simple thing like a pen. And when you have to constantly be so aware of these elements, it is draining.
While they're in Geneva, the volunteers can still hug at least, and the hope is this training will prepare them for what's to come, because the United Nations needs 5,000 volunteers like them, and on this course there were just 30. Imogen Folks, BBC News, Geneva.
Friends, we will have a story tonight that'll be a follow-up to last night's story related to Germany and the UK and their fallout between one another related to European immigration. That story will be coming up, but we've got one more significant story related to this Ebola situation and crisis. There has been speculation that the current outbreak of Ebola in West Africa may have been sparked by the handling of bushmeat. You'll remember, if you watch the program nightly, you may well remember that a couple of weeks ago we showed you some stories related to this one coming up. Nigeria, and I have some scriptures from the Bible I'm going to put up on the screen tonight related to this too, right after this story, right after this video report. Nigeria has been declared free of the virus, but many people's attitude to bushmeat has changed dramatically in recent months. The BBC's Chris Iwakor visited a market called Zimbabwe, just outside the capital, Abuja.
Welcome to Zimbabwe in Nigeria. It's a weekend retreat for many of Abuja's inhabitants. They come here primarily to unwind with beer and local delicacy, bushmeat. But despite the number of day trippers here today, business is on the decline. Bushmeat, the main attraction here, is gradually disappearing off the menu. The reason? Ebola. The theory that the virus originated in wild animals has put many people off game meat. The term bushmeat in these parts refers to any kind of animal found in the wild. So, guinea fowl, cane rats, and antelope are normally readily available, but that's no longer the case.
The sickness of Ebola, this virus of a thing, have killed our business. So like now you are seeing the business is down. And now we are just praying, if at all they will give us go ahead. I think as you can see, the meat we cannot sell. I cook only 6 pieces.
But it is not just people on the outskirts who are choosing to adjust their palates. Before the outbreak, village suppliers would do business with high-end restaurants here in Abuja City. Now though, patrons would rather spend their money on what they deem to be safer choices.
No one comes to any restaurant now and think of saying, give me bushmeat for a delicacy. No. It is as if it is something unheard of. One always go by other options. You have fish, you have mutton, you have beef.
For many though, the theory that Ebola comes from bushmeat remains unproven. The World Health Organization says that the source of past outbreaks was likely human contact with wild animals. However, it stressed the majority of cases are a result of human-to-human transmission. The advice remains the same. Properly prepare and cook all food. Never eat a sick animal, and maintain high levels of basic hygiene. Chris Ewoko, BBC World News, Abuja.
Friends, it's really much more than making sure you cook your meat, and the things he was saying there at the end is really make sure that the meat you're cooking, not that it's just cooked, but make sure that it's cookable meat. In other words, make sure it's edible meat that's clean or edible according to God's Word. And as I said, I've got some scriptures related to that for you. I quoted these the other day, or last time we talked about, and had video related to the people in Africa eating a certain bushmeat that studies proved is a meat that carries the Ebola virus. And as there was a question as to whether people would get it by just eating that meat. They thought some would say that you had to be scratched or bitten by this certain animal to get the virus it carries. But friends, regardless, and I of course, those that are saying you won't get it from eating that meat may have a financial interest in it, but the great God who created all of us, who created mankind, gave us an instruction book in which he tells us he made certain animals to be the vacuum cleaners of the earth, and they're not edible for that reason. They don't have, they're designed to eat the viruses and the junk of the world, and God says these things are here to serve you, to clean up for you, but don't eat them. He says they're unclean, and that includes the bat. Let's look at a couple of scriptures from the clean and unclean meats chapters of the Bible. First, from Leviticus 11, we'll go in on verse 13, where there God instructs us through the writing of Moses to us. Leviticus 11, verse 13, and these are they which you shall have an abomination among the fowls. They shall not be eaten. They are an abomination. And then he starts to name them: the eagle, the ossifrage, and the osprey, and he names several others. Let me come out and change this slide, and we'll go down to the specific verse that mentions the one that carries the Ebola virus, where God says, he goes on with the stork and the heron after her kind, and the lapwing and the bat. And that's the one in the news stories we carried a couple of weeks ago that were telling us that the bat is the carrier of the Ebola virus. Now, some of you who might be saying, hey, well, look, that might be a mistake in the Bible. Somebody must have wrote that up. They didn't mean to say bat. Well, all right, listen, maybe this will help some of you that are having a hard time with that. Deuteronomy 14, another chapter, also covers that same, mentions the bat. Starting in verse 12 of Deuteronomy 14, same subject, clean and unclean meats, and in this part it says, but these are they, God was just telling those that can be eaten, and now he's saying, these are they of which you shall not eat: the eagle, and the ostrich, and the osprey. And then we go again down to the specific verse that mentions the bat. Let me bring that up. It's in verse 18. And the stork, and the heron after her kind, and the lapwing, and the bat. There it is in another chapter of the Bible. This one in Deuteronomy 14. The first one was in Leviticus 11. This one in Deuteronomy 14. Those are your two clean and unclean meats chapters of the Bible. And though our church, friends, has not made a practice of Bible thumping the clean and unclean meats to the public, or people coming in brand new, they find out from other members and from some sermons that would be given back when we were one body and all. It wasn't, and it's just something people, it didn't have to be beat. You didn't have to beat. Once God called people and gave them his Holy Spirit, you didn't have to beat them over the head. Once you explain to them that these certain animals are your vacuum cleaners of the earth, they're not to be eaten. People just, yuck, I don't want to eat that. It's amazing how when God opens up the mind to your understanding and you understand what God is saying, obedience in a certain way becomes easy. Now, there's some things that some of us have to struggle, as Paul himself said, with the flesh to overcome. But there are some things that with knowledge, you can say, oh, I'm not supposed to eat that? Okay, won't eat that. And yet now there are some people that love this bat over there in Africa, but we saw a video report tonight that shows that people are afraid to eat that now, and the sales of bushmeat of all kinds is really dropping in Africa. And hey, that's good to see, because most of that bushmeat is they're switching over to, like the fellow said, to fish and mutton and things that God names in these 2 chapters of Deuteronomy 11 or Deuteronomy 14 and Leviticus 11 as clean and edible meats, and God is not a vegetarian. He didn't design us to be vegetarian. He designed certain meats for us to eat, meats which are good. Now, once in a while it's good to add a little humor into the news. And somebody sent me, friends, before I give you that, though, let me just mention this, because I got the scriptures up in this order. We'll come back about the bat. God says if you obey him, he'll put none of these diseases on you. This was a book in our first year Bible class at Ambassador College in Pasadena. That's a book entitled None of These Diseases, written by an MD, S.I. McMillan. And he got the title of the book from Exodus 15, verse 26, in which God says, if you will diligently hearken to the voice of the eternal Lord your God, and will do that which is right in his sight, and will give ear to his commands, not those that men make up and want to, from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, where man decides for himself what is right and wrong and what his commandments will be, but what God says, and who keep all his statutes, all of God's statutes. God then says, I will put none of these diseases upon you, which I've brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the eternal Lord who heals you. And let's put this screen up and let's emphasize that last part there where it says, I am the eternal Lord God that healeth you. God is our healer, and He made things for us, friends, where we wouldn't have to get sick if we simply obey our Creator. Now, I told you something humorous happened, and it did. I need to change a slide here for you and do something to get this up here. Okay, got it. Now, somebody's put a comment down under one of my videos on my video archive page. It was, I think, intended perhaps as a joke. I think so. Now maybe the person was, no, they couldn't be serious. Here's what they said under my video. They asked me this question. So, is Batman a carrier of the Ebola virus? And let's see. If I got that, I think I got that music. Let me bring that up here for a second. I'm gonna let you look at that for a moment while we play a little studio music here. They sent me this joke. So, is Batman a carrier of the Ebola virus? All right, while that fades out in the background, I'll tell you what we're going to talk about next, friends. We're going to go to the situation. Batman, okay, thank you. Is the Batman a carrier of the Ebola virus? I don't think so. But a little bit of fun with that. Okay. All right, now, get back to where we'll be going next in our serious videos from today's news, friends. We'll go to the situation in Russia, where pro-Russian separatists won the vote in the eastern Ukraine. A pro-Russian separatist has won a leadership vote in eastern Ukraine in an election which has been widely condemned. Alexander Zakarchenko won the vote by some distance, according to the Central Electoral Commission, to lead the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic. The European Union, you'll hear in this video, and the Ukrainian president have both criticized the elections as illegal. Russia has said, you'll hear this, they've said it will respect the will of the people. David Stern reports from Kiev.
The outcome was never in doubt. Alexander Zakarchenko, the acting prime minister of the Donetsk People's Republic, won by a landslide. He said he was ready to talk to authorities in Kiev, but as an independent state.
It is a pity that we still cannot understand the policies Kiev has taken to us. We've long been ready to talk with Kiev. We're looking forward to a rational response from them.
The elections raised tensions in the region even higher. The EU said the vote was illegal and illegitimate and violated a ceasefire agreement that the separatists had signed in September. But Moscow said the elections were valid. Residents said they simply hoped the election would bring stability to their lives.
We hope for peace, for well-being and prosperity of the region, so that everything is fine for us and no one is killed and everyone is alive and well.
However, at the moment, any hope for peace is a distant one. Fighting continued through the weekend, and the Ukrainian army reported a number of their troops killed and wounded. Locals and Western journalists also said a large column of fighters and military hardware arrived from the direction of Russia. Many fear an escalation in the hostilities. Now the elections are over. David Stern, BBC News, Kiev.
For instance, at least 24 people have been killed and scores are missing after a boat said to be carrying migrants sank off the north coast of Istanbul, officials say. The accident took place where the Bosphorus meets the Black Sea. Mark Lowen has this report.
This morning, early on in the morning, a vessel capsized about 5 kilometers north of the Bosphorus Strait in the Black Sea, north of Istanbul. 24 bodies have so far been recovered, 7 rescued, 9 still believed to be missing. It's thought that around 40 people were on board, many of them children. And this was an unusual route, really, for a migrant vessel to take. Turkey is one of the main departure points for those seeking a better life in the European Union, but typically they take these overcrowded dinghies and rubber vessels on the west coast of Turkey heading for Greece. Now, to actually go across the Black Sea has led to speculation that they may have been trying to join to reach Romania. A large rescue operation underway with rescue boats, helicopters and divers, but they fear that number of 24 could still rise.
Okay, and thank you for that report. Friends, I told you that we would have a report tonight on what's happening between Chancellor Angela Merkel and the Prime Minister of the UK. Chancellor Angela Merkel has said Germany won't meddle with free movement in the EU. That's the caption under this picture. Germany won't meddle with free movement in the EU. The suggestion that Angela Merkel would rather see Britain leave the EU than accede to changes to the EU's freedom of movement principle has raised all kind of political temperatures in the UK. Firstly, within the political establishment in Berlin, there is increasing frustration with the UK. They don't know what David Cameron wants and are increasingly sensitive to demands that appear to be endlessly changing. In particular, the Germans are alarmed by the suggestion of caps or quotas or emergency breaks on the members of EU migrants, or the numbers rather of EU migrants arriving in Britain. UK wants to put emergency brakes on the numbers of migrants arriving in Britain. They believe that would undermine freedom of movement. Now that's what the European side, the EU side, believes, that putting numbers, putting caps on that would undermine freedom of movement against what they call a core EU principle. At the European Summit on the 25th of October, Angela Merkel was asked about a possible UK move to change the treaties to reduce the number of migrants. Quote, "We have the basic principle of free movement," said the German Chancellor, "and we won't meddle with that." It was her way of saying free movement was not up for negotiation. She did say Germany had referred the issue of social insurance for migrant workers to the European Court, and she told David Cameron that they would study the opinion very closely. The Germans are concerned that migrants might try to return to Germany just to get benefits. And then, friends, the caption under this photograph from the Der Spiegel says Mrs. Merkel reportedly said she would not try to stop the UK leaving the EU if it insisted on migrant quotas. Now, how's that for a left-handed slap or quote-unquote polite way of saying if you don't want to play by the rules, you can get out. You can take your ball and go home if it is your ball. So the message that Angela Merkel sent to London was clear. There is room for maneuver when it comes to tackling abuses, but there is deep-rooted opposition to any attempts to weaken the principle of free movement itself. That message has been repeated by the new president of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker. The German magazine Der Spiegel has gone further and suggested that Angela Merkel warned David Cameron that his attempts to limit migration risked pushing Britain towards leaving the EU. Quote, "If the British Prime Minister persisted, then she would withdraw her support for Britain staying in the EU." Now, how's that for psychology, friends? Paint the picture so that, like, I'm not going to support you staying in. Like, when people are threatened they're going to lose something, suddenly they often want it. But UK's been talking about having a referendum about whether they should stay in or not anyway. But the Der Spiegel article written by Nicholas Bloom said the UK, your government, is going against some fundamental points of the European Union, which is the free movement of people. And from that point on, it will be more important for the German government to save these European fundamentals in comparison with keeping the United Kingdom inside. Further quote, "It's hard to know precisely." Well, actually, no, I'm sorry. This is a quote now from the BBC's Europe editor, Gavin Hewitt. It's hard to know precisely what Angela Merkel said to David Cameron. A senior official in Berlin has suggested not paying too much attention to the article. And the caption on this photograph from today's news report, friends, says more than 14 million EU citizens are resident in another member state of the EU. Certainly it would be out of character for Angela Merkel to play her hand early. She likes taking decisions at the last moment and resist being backed into a corner. However, there is a weariness with Britain in Berlin and little appetite to give London any special offers or opt-outs. Friends, isn't that interesting what's coming up in today's news in the light of, just been a little more than a half century that Germany was leading World War II against the Allies and wound up, thanks to the Almighty, being forced forced into an unconditional surrender. And now here's Germany branching out boldly, building its military up, and telling one of the allies from World War II that was given a quarter of Berlin, and the UK is just now letting Germany, as if it were, spew out these comments as if Germany was walking all over the UK, and they'll do this with the other allies as well. Watch, this is the trend, the tendency, the direction that things in Germany are heading, and the pulling together of this EU, which biblically is going to come together as a beast power eventually, where those that back up the leader that becomes the head of a United States of Europe confederation, complete federation of Europe, will reborder itself or regionalize itself, or wind up somehow with 5 countries from the west and 5 from the east. They won't get along, but some crisis will cause them to pull together in such a way that they'll give their power to one leader who will be under the direction of the Pope, who will coronate him as an emperor, as the seventh and final head of the Holy Roman Empire, revived one final and last time. But there's more in this story. Let's finish it up here, and then we got to close it up for tonight. That weariness that Germany is now espousing against the UK extends to some in the Chancellor's inner circle, this news story from today says. The caption under this photograph from today's report by Gavin Hewitt says, the British Prime Minister could be looking for ways to limit immigration without undermining free movement. And Gavin Hewitt says it may well be that when David Cameron outlines his position on EU migration sometime between now and the end of the year, he will have dropped the suggestion of capping numbers. It would be hard to progress in the face of determined German opposition. And it may be what this episode is all about. So, in Downing Street, Gavin Hewitt concludes, the search may be on to find a formula that appears to make it harder for EU immigrants to stay in Britain, but does not undermine the principle of free movement. There are indications that the government is looking at whether tax credits can be denied to migrants until they have contributed, or whether migrants will have to show proof of employment and evidence that they can support themselves. Open Europe, a think tank lobbying for radical EU reform, has today argued that national governments, and by today we do mean November 3rd, today has argued that national governments should be able to limit EU migrants' access to out-of-work benefits and social housing until after 3 years. They suggest this could, the United States might want to take a look at something like that too. And I say that partly tongue-in-cheek, and yet I think we all should take that serious from the United States. Should take some serious thinking in that direction as well. That think tank in Europe suggests this could be achieved by amending existing EU law. That is where wiggle room lies. The only question is whether that would be enough for David Cameron to herald as a major reform. What will be very difficult to deliver is limiting net migration to below 100,000, and that will be the problem all the way to the potential referendum in 2017, being able to demonstrate real change as a result of renegotiation. And in the meantime, a fast-charging UK economy acts as a magnet for many EU workers. Read that last comment again by Gavin Hewitt. He says, in conclusion, and in the meantime, a fast-changing, I think that word should be changing. There's R instead of an N there. A fast-changing UK economy acts as a magnet for many EU workers. And, friends, I think, that's all we have for tonight. And God willing, and the creek don't rise, friends, we'll be back again tomorrow night, Tuesday night, with the day's current news related to the Bible and prophecy here on Nightcast. Until next time, this is your host, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth, saying so long and good night, friends.
You have been watching Nightcast with Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth. Nightcast can be seen Sunday through Thursday nights here on COGTV.org. Tonight's program is also available anytime on demand in the COGTV.org video archive.